Good morning, class. Hey, it's Mr. Stewart, and this is going to be your integrity lecture for week 2, which is really covers chapters 2 and 3. Now, I'm going to spend the majority of the time that we have together this morning talking about chapter 3, but I want to talk for just a few minutes about chapter 2. Chapter 2 really has to do with the idea of professionalism in security. And it really talks a lot about the private security professional. And I don't want you to discount Chapter 2 at all. I think our time in this lecture is going to be better spent talking about Chapter 3, because Chapter 2 is very straightforward. It says exactly what it takes to be a professional security employee, what the definition of professionalism is. Whether or not security fits into it, I would say that we do, simply because of basically what it takes to be considered a professional. There's 3 key elements of professionalism that I want you to make sure that you understand and read in Chapter 2. Number 1 is a specialized knowledge, autonomy, and a service ideal. Now, specialized knowledge is exactly that. Having the ability to do something or know something that the rest of the people in the organization may not know. Security is fairly specialized these days. So with that being said, I would say that security officers, facility security officers, security professionals have specialized knowledge. Autonomy is also important, because that means that you have the ability to control entrance into the profession. We don't hire everybody to be a security officer. Everybody that puts in an application to be a security officer with a particular company doesn't get hired. We have the ability to hire who we want based upon them meeting certain criteria and certain standards for entrance. So I would say that security definitely does have autonomy. And then the last thing is a service ideal. And what that really refers to is having a code of ethics. A system of morality, a standard of practice, if you will. And this is something we used to not really have in security, but we do at this point. In fact, most large security companies kind of follow the code of ethics for private security employees. If you look on page 35 in your textbook, there are about 10 Roman numeral items that talk about this, all of these standards, these codes of ethics for security. So make sure you read over that and you familiarize yourself with that. I would say that it's not a lot different than the code of ethics that most police officers also have to swear by, that they're going to abide by that code of ethics as well. So it's not a lot different than that. This chapter further goes into detail about some of the major positions in private security, such as the chief security officer and the chief information officer, which have historically and typically been 2 separate positions within a company. But with the advent of having to provide information security just in the last several years, we're seeing kind of a convergence of the chief security officer, which is called the CSO, and the chief information officer, which is the CIO. We're seeing a convergence of those positions into a single facility security officer, which also handles information as well. It is important to understand that it is 2 roles. They have 2 separate sets of duties, but this convergence is something that has just been happening in the last several years. So your book talks about that on page 37. Your book also goes into detail in this chapter on some of the key competencies of the chief security officer. I think you should be aware of those, because those are key competencies for any security professional, honestly. But especially for the chief security officer for a company or an agency or any employer, being able to engage in certain things, understand certain parts of the job, holding yourself up to a higher standard is going to be necessary. This chapter also goes into detail, talks about the responsibilities of the security director, what some of the administrative responsibilities are. It's all really straightforward, and I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on that. And it also talks, page 44, 45, and 46, about managerial responsibilities. And if you're going to be a facility security officer or a chief security officer, you're going to have some management responsibilities as well as just whatever your job is, which means you're going to have people working under you, and so it's important that you understand some of the dynamics of management just so that you're a good manager. Realize that if you're a terrible manager, your employees probably won't do very well, and you're going to look bad at some point. If you're a good manager, your employees will respect you. They will do the job you ask of them, and they will make you look very, very good without you having to do a whole lot if you're managing them well. So make sure you read over that section in regard to management, as well as hiring security personnel. Not a lot of difference in hiring security personnel as it is for law enforcement personnel these days, simply because most of the time the locations that we're providing security have some sort of government clearance or government contract, which means we can't hire a convicted felon. We can't have people who have certain misdemeanor convictions to be security officers, because that would violate those federal ethical rules as well. It talks about the selection process. It talks about kind of the steps that you go through in the typical employment process. For your own information, I would suggest that you look at that, because many people think you just simply fill out an application, you get a call, and you get hired. In the private security industry, as well as law enforcement too, it's a process, and sometimes it takes a while to get through all of those steps of that process to get hired. And you could be rejected at any point, and that's the thing you also need to understand. Even a rejection during a selection process may not necessarily have anything to do with you, but what it may have to do with is maybe there was just somebody else that was better qualified. And sometimes that's a hard pill to swallow too, especially when you think you know everything there is to know about something. You know, I've met with rejection myself. I've interview went extremely well, thought I had a job, and somebody else got hired. And sometimes it's not even about me. Sometimes it's not about you. Sometimes it's simply about who that employer wants to put in that position. The politics of it, that happens too. So just understand, it's a process to get hired anywhere. Well, once you get hired, you must maintain a level of professionalism. You always want to strive to increase your job performance. You can do that by knowing what the job description is and trying to live up to it. Always engage in as much training as possible to better prepare yourself for the job. And also be familiar with the equipment that you're issued. Don't use any equipment that you're not trained on. I know it says that somewhere in Chapter 2, but I can't emphasize that enough, that security agencies in the past have been very notorious about, here's the latest and greatest piece of equipment, and we don't give you any training, and go out and use it, and don't kill anybody. And I know that sounds kind of humorous, but unfortunately, that has been the typical and historical norm. We're starting to see a movement away from that at this point, but just understand there's still some companies out there that do some very similar things. Also think about getting certifications to increase your level of professionalism as a security professional. If you use ASIS, which is American Society for Industrial Security, they have several different certifications, such as a Certified Protection Professional, Certified Investigator, Physical Security Professional. There's a test involved. It's kind of a lengthy process and fairly expensive to get. But if you have those certifications by your name and you apply for a job, they know what your level of standard is. They know what your level of competence is. They know that you have the skill set necessary to do that job. So I always suggest pursuing a certification in whatever your profession is. And understand that that kind of the last thing I want to talk about in regard to professionalism is that you are projecting an image of the security company you work for, and you're projecting an image to the public of the company. If you are slovenly, if you are unkempt, if you are acting in an unprofessional way, it sheds bad light upon the company as well as your employer. So just keep that in mind and act and look professional at all times. And in a nutshell, that's all I really want to talk about in regard to Chapter 2. I know that was about 7, 8, 9 minutes, but covered a little bit. It took me a little longer than I wanted, but I wanted to mention certain key parts of Chapter 2 to draw your attention to while you're reading that chapter. Okay. Chapter 3 is also very important. Chapter 3 has to do with the public-private interface. And I want you to understand that that's something that security professionals do all the time. You are a private agency, but you're working out in the public. And again, it's about professionalism, and you are projecting an image. You know, understand that there's historically been some friction between public security, what we know of as the police, and private security, because they often see themselves in competition. Interestingly enough, they are not in competition whatsoever. The police have enough to do without having to worry about private security. However, the police often view private security as kind of wannabes, people that couldn't make the grade to be police officers, so they settle for the next best thing, which they think is working security. I have worked with some security officers that really thought that they were God's gift to policing, and the reason they weren't police officers is because they couldn't make the grade. And it's those type of security officers that do give the rest of us a bad name. There was a time when security hired any warm body that would come fill out an application because they needed somebody to fill a position. And when you have a need, you put yourself in kind of a bad place that you can't be as selective in your hiring process. However, we're not seeing that as much today. We're seeing a lot of competition for jobs, and that's causing the applicant pool to be much more professional than it has ever been in the past. So let's think about some of the attitudes towards security over the years. In the 1960s, it was kind of indifferent. It was a job. It wasn't looked upon as a professional job. It was a job to bring home some money, and it was almost a job that anybody could do. Typically it was working overnight in some warehouse, and you weren't going to stop anything from happening. You weren't going to make any arrests. You're simply there, and you're pulling on doors to make sure they're locked, and you're walking around, and it's just having somebody there. It's almost like having a live burglar alarm. In the 1970s, we saw a lot of mistrust of authority, and it wasn't necessarily just security. It was police in general. The general populace, the citizenry in our country really had a lot of distrust of any type of authority, and especially the security industry, because we had hired a bunch of idiots. I mean, seriously, there were a lot of people who never should have been hired as security officers who were working as security officers in the 1970s, and so it kind of brought some bad light upon the industry. The 1980s and 1990s is most likely regarded as a period of collaboration and joint ventures. We saw the police and security working much closer together. The police saw a need for security in many things, and it really helps the police out because then they can focus their attention on the things they need to focus their attention on, and security can do its job. And it's two separate focuses. We talked about that, I talked about that in a lecture last week. It's definitely two separate focuses. Let's think for a few minutes about some of the reasons police may not be confident in security. They lament the quality of their pre-employment screening, training, and standards because they're not the same. They're not as high, pardon me, as law enforcement's pre-employment screening, training, and standards. There are a couple security companies out there in the country that are very stringent as to who they hire, but most of them have a lesser screening standard, less training, and a different pre-employment hiring standard and practice than law enforcement do. So police look at that as, I can't believe you hired this person to be security. This person I arrested last week, or I've had a contact with this person. We wouldn't hire him. Why would the security hire him? Type of thing. Police officers also doubt the quality and the amount of the private security officers' firearms training if they're armed security. We know they don't have the same amount of training law enforcement uses and has. However, we also know that the likelihood of a private security officer using their weapon in the line of duty is much less than a law enforcement officer. And it's also, the purpose of carrying a firearm is different. Police carry a firearm for a lot of different reasons. One is to stop crimes if necessary. Security officers don't use a firearm to stop crime. They use a firearm to either protect the life of someone else or protect their own life if they find themselves in a situation. So, of course, their firearms training is not going to be as intense as law enforcement's firearms training is. But police officers often view that as, they just don't need to be carrying a firearm because they can't shoot it as well as I can. And they view security officers as wannabes. There's a lot of them that are. There's a lot of security officers that they get that security badge, and they wear it around on everything. They wear it off duty, and they want people to know that they're a security officer, and it projects this idea that, hey, I want to be the police, and police officers see that, and I'm like, that's unprofessional. You shouldn't do that. Police often view security officers as a threat to their domain. For many years, police officers kind of had the industry sewed up as far as working off duty and security. That was almost guaranteed overtime for police. And we're seeing a movement away from that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We're seeing a movement away from that at this point, and police officers are thinking, well, they're threatening our livelihood. They're threatening our ability to get overtime. Police often also don't understand the depth of the security field. They don't understand exactly what all security does. There's more to security than simply, sitting on a gate, controlling access, or walking a beat in a warehouse in the nighttime or something like that. There's a whole lot more to it than that. Security is often not confident in the police as well, because they know the police look down upon them to a certain degree. So they view the police as being elitist. They also feel that the police don't really care about or appreciate the security field until they want a job in it. They almost turn their back on it. They ignore security until, hey, they want some overtime or they want to retire and get a security job, and then then they're kind of courting the field almost. So just understand that security is also not as confident in police as they should be. And this lack of communication has caused kind of a rift to emerge in the industry. We've seen since 9/11 that rift to be repaired quite well, but prior to 9/11 there was a huge rift between the police and security. Understand that private security is growing exponentially. Private security officers outnumber regular police officers 5 to 1, and in most places, in other places it's even more than that. In some states where you have a large private security population, like California, in Huntsville, we have a large private security population here as well. I also understand there's a lot of movement between the two fields. Police officers will retire, get into security. Security officers will use security as a stepping stone to move into law enforcement. Then you also see employed police officers moonlighting or working overtime in security. Again, we're seeing less and less of that as time goes on, but we have seen that a lot in the last several years. The practice of officers working off-duty security does present some issues. There's workers' comp issues. And the reason I say that there's workers' comp issues is that, does a police officer ever quit being a police officer? And the answer to that in most states is no. You simply just may not be at work. You're a police officer 24/7, 365, and leap year 366, and you are required to act in a official manner in many cases, if you see certain types of crimes in progress, you are required to act in an official capacity as a police officer. That may be in direct violation or opposition to the focus of security. They may not want you to be making arrests. They may not want you to pull your gun on somebody. They may not want you to try to be catching people who are doing something at that time, but they may simply want you to observe, report, and document. That's hard for a police officer to do, and in some cases they can't legally just do that either. Workers' comp issues, if you get hurt as a security officer, but you are in fact enforcing the law, who pays workers' comp? Is that the security agency or your law enforcement agency? It's a problem. There's also authority issues. You can take the uniform off the police officer, but you can't take the police officer out of the police officer. They're going to always revert back to that authority. Police, stop, do as I say, because they're used to that. That gets them places in their regular job, and you can't always be that way in private security. So we've started to see a movement away from private security, from police officers working in private security off duty. There's still some companies that do it, and in many cases there's not a lot of issues with it, but we are starting to see some issues arise because of the difference in the change in the focus. There's 4 basic differences between officers from the public and the private sector. Understand that private security is a for-profit entity. Law enforcement is not for profit. Private security serves specific clients, not the public at large. Security is prevention-oriented, where police work tends to be reactive. So security is proactive. Police are reactive. Police typically respond after something has happened. Security is there to try to prevent something from happening. Police also have statutory authority, which means they have the ability to make arrests, to enforce the law, to give commands that people must follow, and they may even deal with non-criminal conduct. But they still have authority over that person, whereas security typically doesn't have any more authority than the general citizen does. And that's another thing that police officers look down upon security, because security employees often feel like, now I'm security, I can make an arrest, I can detain, I can investigate. And police officers are like, no, you can't. You have no more authority than any general citizen does. Yes, you can make a citizen's arrest. I don't recommend that. Why? Liability issues. If you make a citizen's arrest and you are incorrect, you're going to be sued for everything you have. I guarantee it. So legal authority. Police have a much greater legal authority and power than private security does. They typically just have the same legal authority as private citizens. However, private security can enforce company rules and regulations that the police would not be able to enforce, because it's not a law, it's a company regulation. When you're on company property, you have to go by their rules. So security can enforce those where police could not. So you see that the difference in the focus also cause a difference in what they can and cannot do. Private security officers do not have to issue Miranda warnings to people that they're questioning, especially if it's in regard to company rule violations on company property. However, they may be required to inform the employee of their what's called the Weingarten rights, and basically that an employee who is being questioned in an investigatory interview by private security has the right to union representation if they wish, if it's a union shop, so to speak. If there's no union in the location, you don't have a right to union representation. But just understand, if there's a union and your employee is a member of the union and you start to question them about corporate rule violations or policy violations, if they want a union representative there to help them, they are entitled to that under what's called the Weingarten Rights Doctrine. An investigatory interview. This is something private security officers can do. This is when a supervisor or a security professional questions an employee about a subject that could result in discipline. And these are not necessarily law-breaking violations. They could be, but most of the time it's simply corporate policy or rule violations, such as being late, being absent from work, drinking or using drugs, fighting, sabotaging the company, poor work performance or safety violations, stealing from the company, or any other miscellaneous reasons that you need to talk to the employee about something, and you're trying to get them to elicit some incriminating information. Basically say, yeah, I did something wrong. Then that's what we would call an investigatory interview. It's important to note that due to the nature of their work, security officers performing jobs do open themselves up to liability. It's typically civil liability, which means that you can be sued for something. So you need to understand what your limitations are. Now, these are very important for private security. You cannot invade somebody else's privacy. You might be able to search their desk. You might be able to search their office. You might be able to search their locker. However, you may not be able to search that person, because the Fourth Amendment still gives you the right to against unlawful searches of your person, your effects, your papers, your home, just anything that is company property. Though you can search it, so you cannot invade somebody else's privacy. You cannot electronically eavesdrop, which means you cannot bug somebody's office. They do have somewhat of a right to privacy in their office. You cannot trespass on other people's property. In some states, security officers are not allowed to wear a uniform or a badge that even resembles a police officer's. The state of New York is one of those. In fact, their security officers have to wear this big square monstrosity-looking badge, and their uniforms are quite different than any uniform anywhere else in the state, so that you know that person is a security officer. You go to other states like California, many of the security officers look just like the police. Some of them are just as well trained as the police also. And police officers also cannot commit crimes. I mean, that should go without saying. But just understand, you can't commit a crime. Neither can a police officer. But you'd be surprised at how many people would say, well, you didn't say that, so therefore we must be able to do it. Understand that there has to be a cooperative or a collaborative effort between the police and the security these days. They typically work much more closely together. They partner on things. Security takes up the slack where police officers can't. Police officers do the things they need to do so the security officers can do what they need to do. It is a collaborative and a cooperative effort. There has been a movement toward privatizing things with private security over the last several years that has historically been handled by the police or by state or public employees, such as responding to alarms. As a police officer, I've been to I don't know how many burglar alarm calls at people's residences. Pardon me. Now we're starting to see security officers have mobile patrol units, and they will answer those calls, and they will call the police if they need to, but that frees up the police to not have to make those responses. Examining evidence in private labs. We're starting to see labs get privatized at this point. Conducting background checks. Protecting executives and VIPs. Engaging in crowd control at sporting events or concerts and such. Transporting prisoners. I personally have done that in a private capacity. I worked for Corrections Corporation of America. I transported inmates all over these United States. I went to every state in the lower 48, every major city in the lower 48, and a lot of little bitty places you'd never want to go or you never even thought existed, to pick up and drop off a prisoner somewhere. That's something that historically has been done by the police. That's something that's been privatized. Prisons are now privatized as well. You've got three major corrections corporations in the country that try to operate a private correctional facility cheaper. And a couple things they have to keep in mind. The in regard to the privatization of correctional facilities. Is that privatization legal? Can they be more effective and cheaper to operate, and do they produce a better prisoner? What we're really talking about there is, will the state statute in your state allow that prison to be privatized? If so, can you contract with this company and just pay them a fee, and you don't have to worry about hiring, training, or even taking on liability issues? That's something that the company takes on. You've transferred risk is what it amounts to when you privatize a prison. The key things to understand, though, is, can the private prisons be as effective and cheaper to operate than a state-ran or locally ran correctional facility? They may or may not be, depending upon how well they're run. And will they produce a better prisoner? There really have been no studies that documented whether prisoners from private facilities are more or less likely to reoffend than their publicly held counterparts. You have a 70% recidivism rate anyway, so I don't really know if we'll ever get a good answer to this question, but it's something that you have to consider. And this might be a selling point for privatization, is that they can say, well, we offer this and we offer this, that rehabilitation program, and we do this and we do that, and therefore our own internal studies show that our prisoners are least likely to reoffend because we offer all these programs and such. So, keep that in mind. That's kind of off on a little bit of tangent, but it just shows you how far-reaching this field of private security is when we can privatize a jail, a prison, the transportation of prisoners. If you go back up and you look, are we now responding to burglar alarm calls? Are we now conducting lab analysis of evidence? Are we protecting people that typically off-duty police officers had to do? And if we can do all of that well, if we can be effective at it and we can do it cheaper, then that's the way that the industry is going to go. And that's why there's a hefty competition out there among security companies to try to obtain contracts, and people will underbid and undercut. The issue is do you get the quality of work that is necessary based upon the amount of money that you're paying? All right. Recommendations for building private and public partnerships. The leaders have got to get together, and they need to make a formal commitment to cooperate with each other. They've got to fund research and training on legislation that would allow that to happen. They need advisory boards. And local partnerships should really determine what the local issues are and try to address those. What are the benefits of this cooperation? Well, it prepares private security to assist in emergencies. You have a force multiplier, if you will. You have a cadre of folks who can be called to assist in a flood or an earthquake, or if anarchy breaks out or whatnot. And they do help coordinate homeland security efforts, as most infrastructure is privately owned, such as your power grids, your food production facilities, your water utilities. All those things need to be protected, but most of them are privately owned, so therefore the police aren't going to be able to protect them. So you need a cadre of people to do that. It increases personnel, resources, and expertise, such as in cybercrime, which is a major issue today. And because it's a major issue, we need more people who are trained in investigating and preventing cybercrime. We can also assist the police in their investigations, because we typically take TV recordings of things, and we catch things on that camera, and we can provide that information to the police as well. We can reduce the number of that should be calls. Sorry about that. Number of calls for service, because we're preventing things from happening. Individuals from each side know who their counterparts are and what services they provide and how they can assist. It also builds law enforcement's understanding of corporate needs. It increases training opportunities and builds mutual respect. We've seen that happen since 9/11. All of that collaboration and cooperativeness that we talked about that should happen in private security really has happened since 9/11. We saw a need to protect infrastructure and private things. We saw that there was a deficit in training, a deficit in personnel, and we've met that need, and that's why this is such a good field to get into right now. It's such a growing field. The job outlook is excellent. It has a much higher growth potential than law enforcement does. In fact, law enforcement has about a 7% growth potential over the next decade. Security has over 20%. That's huge. That means that if you want to work in security and move up in the ranks of security, you can. All right, guys. That's chapters 2 and 3 in a nutshell. Make sure you're reading the chapters. Make sure you're participating in the discussion boards and getting your weekly assignments in. And I'll see you in Integrity Lecture next week. Bye-bye.